If anyone's still awake, I'll be glad to take any questions you have. Yes, sir.
Mr. Peterson, from where I come from, not one but two references to Maggie Thatcher is a great day. Your book, your talk, reminds me a little bit of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. Is it already too late?
Well, no, I have this feeling, and I hope I'm wrong. I think it's urgently important that we avoid the harder landing. We will have a hard landing at some point, not only because other countries may need their capital for their own purposes, but because they lose confidence. I think if they saw that we were serious about reform, it would give us substantially more time to make the program sustainable. However, if all of the programs that come out of the current program, of the current administration, or any new administration, is just another free lunch in which all we're doing is adding to the cost, then that could be a factor that will increase the lack of confidence in this economy. Anything that increases the lack of confidence increases the odds of the harder landing, in my opinion. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Yes,
Where do you see the constituency coming from to support these enlightened views? If you look at sort of groups representing the elderly, they never want any change in their benefits.
Well, it may seem pathologically optimistic, but I hate the alternative so desperately. Let's take the 9/11 Commission on Intelligence. Anybody with any knowledge at all of our intelligence structure would have told you for at least 10 years that this was a structure that was flawed in some pretty fundamental ways. We had a group of Americans of the quality of Tom Keene and Lee Hamilton and others who transcended the usual partisan politics, who studied the problem thoughtfully, who got on television, who got in the media. They explained the problems, I think, and whether you agree with every one of their reforms, that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is in response to your question. They had enough political effect, it seems to me, that the Congress started falling all over itself, maybe too rapidly, I don't know, to reform the programs. And I'm reasonably confident that in the next several months we will have a reform structure. I would hope on a problem of this sort, if the Americans are of sufficient credibility, and I want to underline the point, I don't want the usual constituencies here that we get on commissions, because just trust me, it will be more, more, and more. When I was on the Clinton Entitlement Reform Commission, the research director of the AARP appeared, the American Association of Retired Persons. You might imagine I'm one of their folk heroes in American life. That was supposed to be funny, but apparently it wasn't. This fellow stood up there, and this commission had agreed unanimously with a bipartisan staff that the programs were unsustainable. And by 2025, these programs would be consuming the entire budget. So this gentleman has the, I guess one would say, chutzpah to appear. And when he was asked to reform the programs, we got a long catalog of increased benefits. So Alan Simpson, a fellow Republican, and I from Wyoming had the effrontery to say, "Sir, you apparently haven't read our report. You've been remarkably specific in your catalog of new benefits. But since you know we've concluded the current programs are unsustainable, we would be terribly interested with equal specificity on how you're going to reduce the cost of the current programs. All of a sudden, this gentleman, who had been remarkably and unambiguously specific, resorts to a bunch of glittering generalities. Well, we would be willing to work with you. Well, I say, you have the opportunity right here, work with us. So if this ever degenerates into a commission of constituencies, it'll never work. It'll only work if the people are of such quality that the Americans say this must be real. I can't say the odds are high. I'm just telling you what I very much hope will happen.
Over
Yes,
here, sir. I've got the mic. Mr. Peterson, on your left.
Yes. Oh.
Excuse me, I'm Steve Brandt, a FPA member, and sort of related to that, how to get the American people to recognize this challenge and support their leaders in dealing with it. I'm concerned about the analysis of how the election results were what they were, and that the people who determined our choice, they don't think about these challenges. They're more dealing in emotional terms. And how to communicate to them, I'm racking my brain about how to get that dialogue going. I mean, there's a certain sense where you can sometimes use a celebrity to talk about an illness because the celebrity is sick. That gives a connection to people. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how to reach the people who, for lack of a better term, seem to be more emoters than thinkers.
Well, that would be one of the principal roles of people like Bob Rubin and Paul Volcker and Sam Nunn and Warren Rudman. Now, I hope this doesn't sound partisan, but I'm trying to indicate the problem we have in this country. I've indicated I support the idea of having accounts that are truly funded, because the fundamental problem of these systems are not funded. But I'm old-fashioned enough to, when I ask the awkward question, where are the funds going to come from? And I make some specific proposals for doing that, by reducing the cost and by having a mandatory savings plan. The President sincerely believes in personal retirement accounts, but as I've indicated, I think there's some dangers in having retirement accounts. We have a friend here from Citigroup. If the average income in the United States is $40,000, you're going to take 10% of the payroll tax, you're talking about $600 accounts. You tell me what the administrative costs will be on those kind of programs. But a more fundamental question the President has to be asked is, if you're taking 10% of the revenues out and you're not cutting the benefits, you have a transition period in which you have very substantial additional costs, which have been estimated to be $1 to $2 trillion. So I come back to what I said. I don't see a solution to this problem that does not involve some benefit reductions. I gave you some of them that could be done, that can be humane, that preserve the safety net for the people that need it, and so forth. But if all we keep doing is adding to the problem under the guise of solving it, we are making the problem worse. Yes, sir?
I would really appreciate if you share your views on how do we help and maybe educate Americans to stop consuming less, stop importing less, and all this in the big picture of the current account deficit. I find your thoughts on attacking the retirement and pension fund shortfalls very insightful. I would appreciate if you comment on that issue.
Well, you know, one of the, I'm not a historian, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a lot of things. But a lot of us have forgotten in America that 60 or 70, 80 years ago, we were the biggest savers in the world. And we've gone from the biggest savers to the lousiest savers in the world and the biggest borrowers. And I think there's a very good book for somebody to write, and I'm not capable of doing it, on how this has come about. But I've got a few ideas on that subject. At the end of the Second World War, we were the only country in the world that had an industrial plant that was in great shape. The rest of the world needed to rebuild its plant, and therefore it was desperately interested in savings to provide capital. They set up a tax system that essentially encouraged savings. We, in turn, created a system that discouraged savings and encouraged consumption. We had a huge tax on what was called unearned income, you may recall, 70, 80%. My Japanese friends used to say to me, Mr. Peterson, what are you doing? The hardest income in the world that you have is where you have to not consume and save, and you are making it awkward. We came up with mortgage interest deductions because we wanted to keep the construction business going and so forth. My wife is the founder of Sesame Street, and she's educated me on how other countries handle the question of messages that we impart to our children. I've had a bunch of kids and grandkids, and we see the barrage of what we send to our children at very young ages, of buy, and buy more. So I know it sounds like a brute conclusion, but I can tell you that this group of experts I had believe that we had better follow the example of Chile and a few other places and make savings mandatory, because it's going to be very hard to change this country's obsession with consumption. Just imagine our consumer debt ratio in this country. I've forgotten whether it's the last 15 or 20 years. At the same time that our personal savings rate has fallen from 8% to less than 1%, the consumer debt as a percent of the GDP has gone from about 45% to 85%. It's a stunning, and as you know from our mortgage refinancing and so forth, we've essentially taken equity and we've spent it. And it's going to take quite a jolt, I think, to get Americans to change their consumption obsession. Quite a jolt.
One last question.
Hi. Mr. Peterson, the program that you've outlined would take enormous political courage for any political leader to even contemplate. Is there anyone on the horizon that you see today who might step forward with that kind of political courage? And I'm very happy if you name names.
Well, it may not be in my self-interest to do that, but as I say, I'm an equal opportunity basher. Aside from the people I mentioned, I think John McCain is a person who the Concord Coalition that I helped found is honoring next week, and if some of you want to make a contribution, we'd be happy to accept it. Is one of a handful of Americans who calls it straight. He had the temerity to, on the Medicare prescription drug bill, vote against it on the grounds that until he saw equivalent measures to reduce costs, he was not going to support an expansion of a program that was already unsustainable. There aren't many, but there are 2 or 3 around maybe who could lead. But ultimately, this can take the President of the United States. It's going to take a bipartisan effort. You know, the current election, there's been a lot of talk about values, you know, and moral issues and so forth. I absolutely refuse to believe that parents and grandparents, as I indicated, don't love their children. And as I talk around the country, I find that that argument of being fair to our own kids is a very powerful argument. And it really hasn't been made yet, in my opinion. Because when most parents understand what we're doing to our kids, they say, well, gee, that's awful. I hadn't realized this. So I think there are ways of developing programs. I've given you just a few ideas, where you still preserve a safety net for the people that need it, but you dramatically reduce the cost. And that's what we're going to have to do. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.